Welcome back. My name is Drew Lash. I am a member of the 2020 UCLA graduate cohort, and I am honored today to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Deborah L. Krohn. Professor Krohn teaches Italian Renaissance, decorative arts, and cultural history at the Bard Graduate Center in New York City, where she is associate professor and chair. She holds a bachelor and master's from Princeton University and a PhD, a doctorate from Harvard University. Her research and teaching areas include early modern European art and cultural history, history and theories of museums, culinary history, and history of the book. She is interested in relationships between objects of daily life, including the arts of the kitchen and the table, the dissemination of both learned and practical knowledge through books and prints. Her research appears in Food and Knowledge in Renaissance Italy, Bartolomeo Scappi's Paper Kitchens, which was published in 2015, which focuses on the history and reception of the first illustrated cookbook of Europe, published in 1570, through print culture and book history. Today, we will be hearing her talk, The Spectacular Table in Europe, 1500 to 1800. Please help me in welcoming Professor Krohn.
Thank you so much, Drew, and thank you to Paul Smith for extending the original invitation, and to Sosa for coordinating tonight, and to all of the panelists and the speakers and the organizers and everybody who has worked to put this together. I can't tell you what a great honor it is for me to be here tonight. I do wish that we were together in person, as all of us do, although I feel like that's become a kind of cliche of COVID. But cliche, nevertheless, very sincere. And I'm so impressed with all of your topics and your delivery and your polish and all of that. It's hard to believe that you are sort of early in your careers as graduate students and as scholars and curators and professionals. So it's really inspiring to be here this evening. So, among the various collateral effects of the pandemic, we've all retrenched into our own homes, and in many cases, there's been a rekindling or maybe a reconciliation with our own kitchens and with the daily rhythms of food preparation and service. And though never really far from the center of our lives, food seems to have become even more entangled with our ways of understanding both present and past, as I think has been amply demonstrated here. It's both the subject and the object, both the material and the message. And in the Q&A, I'd be interested to find out how many of you, how the past couple of years have played an impact on your choice of topic, and how it's maybe shifted your focus away from more traditional kinds of art into this very sort of hybrid interdisciplinary area that involves food. And that's really a fascinating, I think, a really fascinating area to think about. So the topic of my presentation this evening is an exhibition and a book that I'm in the process of finishing right now, that's going to open at the Bard Graduate Center in February of 2023, so a little more than a year from now. And over the next 30, 40 minutes or so, I'd like to take you through some of the plans for the exhibition and outline some of the core questions and show you some of the key texts that I'm working with. This is definitely work in progress. I'm super interested if there are responses on that level as well and when we get to the Q&A. So, as I think we've seen from the other presentations this evening, food is it's challenging to display. A number of you have shown videos, and I think that's something that wasn't available to people in the early modern period. So that's not really part of my presentation, but that's a perception that I had, the idea that you could record an experience in video. And it's even harder to preserve through time as an object food, obviously, because it's organic, because it decays, it doesn't last. That's the very nature of food. It is ingested, it goes back to nature, it comes from nature and goes back to nature. So I'm going to start now. I guess I should share my screen. Just hold on a second. Let's see if I can do that. Okay, share, and there we go. And what is that? Hold on a second, get that. Okay, great. Okay, can you all see that? Okay, good. Okay, so why does it have that annoying thing that says you're sharing? Okay, was that going to go away? Maybe I can move that away. Okay, good. I got it out of the way. Fine. Okay, sorry about that. Here we go. So among 20th century artists, to add to the list of and 21st century artists so that we've seen this evening, who've used the social valence of food and of dining as a medium, is Roquet Tervanit. His original piece was staged in New York in 1992. This consisted of the artist cooking pad thai in an East Village gallery and inviting the viewers to eat the food for free. And it has various names. It's called Free or Free Still. It was super successful and kind of groundbreaking, and it was revived in 2007 and by David Zwirner in his Chelsea gallery, and it's now scheduled for a second revival at Zwirner's Hong Kong gallery in 2022. So it's had a long lifespan. Essentially, it's a performance of cooking and eating that's being restaged. There's no attempt to preserve any kind of object that was part of the original performance. It's the experience, and it's also had a kind of very vivid life in sort of journalism and the internet. There are lots of magazines that have actually published what purported to be his recipe for pad thai. So if you Google it, that's one of the things you'll find. So this piece, whether it's the original or the revival, or these are just a couple there, it's been staged in versions of it in lots of different places over the years. But it's considered a prime example of relational aesthetics, which is art that is about exchange, and the viewers, the visitors are completely integrated with the experience, and it's about what happens in the room. It's not about the objects themselves, but it's about the way they inspire sociability between the people that are experiencing it. And the dissolution of those barriers is something that can be seen on a continuum with earlier staged events that took place around a table and involved the serving of eating of food. You know, at our end, and obviously that's already, it's somewhat historical at this point, even though it's still continuing, but it's a historical thing. It's Tervanit's pad thai. At the beginning of this process are ancient Roman banquets recorded by writers such as Petronius and his Satyricon. But as you're all learning, I hope, in graduate school, research projects and exhibitions work best when they're dealing with a defined and demarcated topic and time span. So my project, which the current working title is slightly different from the title of the talk, it's Staging the Table in Europe, 1500 to 1800. I'm still kind of trying to work with that. It may change again. But this project traces the figure of the professional carver who's responsible for slicing and serving meats, fowl, fish, and fruit at the table from the late Middle Ages up until around 1800. So to start completely out of order, I'm showing you a hand-colored print of a famous banquet that took place in Nuremberg, Germany in 1649 to celebrate the Peace of Westphalia, which was a big deal. It ended this very difficult period, 30 years of war between a lot of different European powers. And in a moment, I'm going to switch to a different version of it. But what I don't know how big your screens are and what you can see, but can you see my cursor moving around here? This is my pointer. This sort of figure on the table, which looks like a swan. And then there's people, there's musicians, and there's all kinds of stuff. I'm going to switch to another version of this, sort of from the same event that's it's a little bit easier to see. It's also it's a print. The other one was a hand colored print, but you can see on the table there's all kinds of sort of sculptures, and there are servers who were marching into the room with what look like live birds. There's a swan, a peacock. It's a pretty elaborate setting. You can still see it's the same room. It's got the musicians on either side. So this particular banquet was described at the time by a man named Georg Philipp Harsdorfer, whose name you'll hear again. It's not on the screen, but he'll come back later, who was a humanist, a poet, a mathematician, and an author of folding and carving books. And he described the event that in this way. There were 3 special kitchens set up. There were 12 cooks who were engaged to prepare 6 courses, each with multiple dishes, soups, roasts, game, fish, savory pies, fruits and silver chargers, and on live trees. And then sugar-coated flower petals were strewn on the table. And finally, the 6th and final course was brought in, consisting of sugar sculptures and sweets served in marzipan bowls. So everything would have been edible. So it was an incredible tour de force of sculpture, of performance, of food, and a lot of it took place behind the scenes, obviously with the chefs, but then it was all brought out, and this image captures a little bit of that at least. The meal here is a theatrical spectacle complete with what in German were called Schaugerichten or Schauessen, ornamental dishes. And this is a Baroque banquet at its best, a dynamic arena that provided a temporary stage for what would later be called a Gesamtkunstwerk. That's not a word that we really see until the 19th century. It's a total work of art, but it combined the visual, the oral, the intellectual, the olfactory, and of course, taste, of course, eating and tasting these things. So the date of this event, which is permanently recorded in books such as Harsdorfer, again, his manual, which includes instructions for carving meats and folding napkins, falls squarely in the middle of this historical continuum that I've traced from antiquity to 1800, let's say. So from antiquity, the carving of meat was sacred spectacle and also necessary task. Ancient sources suggest well-honed skills. In a lot of cultures, butchering of animals was governed by religious strictures in order to assure that the proper portions were offered to the gods, leaving other portions for human consumption. The history of the illustrated carving books that I'm interested in starts in concept in pre-literate times with passing down of artisanal knowledge and craft knowledge through apprenticeship and other forms of informal education. But by the late Middle Ages, the persistence of these traditions becomes evident in troubadour poetry and other discursive forms, music, song, in addition. So not text, that's my point. It was a performative thing, epics. One of the earliest images to document a carver is this illustration of the month of January from the Très Riche Heures of the Duc de Berry, where a group of very beautifully dressed courtiers crowd around a table that's laden with all kinds of foods. And the Duke is sitting here in this blue, dark blue, oh, sorry, that's my cursor is doing its own thing there. I will just use my words and not point. He's there in his blue gown with pomegranates, And directly in front of him with his back turned to us is a man wearing a green robe, and he's holding a knife. He has a what looks like a towel or a great big a piece of linen that's draped over his left shoulder, and around his waist he has a black bag that looks like a kind of toolkit, and that's exactly what it is. This is a carver. So this is a very a nice representation of who the carver was. An essential officer at feasts, at banquets, and one of many highly regarded servants whose presence helped to demonstrate wealth and prestige at important events like this. The earliest prescriptive text to actually describe rituals for carving is actually in Spanish, and it's called the Arte Cisoria. It's written by Enrique de Villena, who was a courtier to Alfonso of Aragon in the 15th century, but it was not published until the 18th century. So I'm showing you a couple of pages that describe the kinds of knives that the courtly carver should have from the 18th century. Like almost all of the later carving manuals that I'll be showing you, there are elaborate instructions not only on the proper way to carve, but on the personal comportment of the carver, including his clothing, the way his nails are to be cut, the length of his beard, the way he should smell, and that is he has to avoid onions, garlic, leeks, cilantro, and to avoid smoke, horses, and foundries. So, I mean, the olfactory dynamic is super important in terms of the personality and the presence of this person at the table. And of course, it also describes the kinds of knives and forks he's supposed to have. And here's just this one illustration from that book. There's some very rudimentary sort of sketchy things in the manuscript that are, this is a more compelling visual document, but they do exist. So this is using those manuscript sketches to kind of come up with something. But it's the extent to which this book prescribes a set of practices that recurs in many texts confirms both that by this time there were sort of set protocols, and by this time I mean sort of early 15th century, but also that extend much later. So there's a genre, let's say. In England, there were rhyming didactic verses that were meant to educate mainly boys in proper behavior at court, that were committed first to manuscript and then to print between the 14th and 15th centuries, the most well-known of which is John Russell's Book of Nurture, which is then published in a prose kind of reduction in 1508 that's called the Book of Carving. And it doesn't have any illustrations except for this title page, which I'm showing you here. This text deals explicitly with carving, including in the title. And it includes a section which comprises an incredibly specific vocabulary about carving meats. Each animal demanded a particular verb for its undoing. The carver must break a deer, rear a goose, lift a swan, spoil a hen, fruche a chicken, and it goes on and on. It's an incredibly detailed, and it's a lot of words that are no longer used in English. Actually, it's sort of Old English. It's sort of transitional, but it's verbs that are lost in current use. So that brings me to the point that one of the rationales for this exhibition comes from the textual linking of skills and tools. I'm interested in material culture, so instructions on how to clean and sharpen the knives and how to fold the linens. The first text to illustrate the actual tools of the carver was published in Italy in 1520. It was called The Refuge of the Poor Gentleman, and is dedicated to the carver's patron, who is Alfonso d'Este of the Duke of Ferrara, who's famous for a lot of other things in terms of art history. But it contains a single image printed over 2 pages of a suite of knives in silhouette with their functions indicated. So what they're used for: fruit, dismembering meat, cake, and then you can see the two small ones for fruit and meat. So the forks. So in fact, not terribly detailed, but still, it's a really, I think, very fascinating image. The preface of this book provides an illustrious classical origin for the arts of carving, which has the effect of putting this text in the company of other kinds of humanist texts that claim prestige through association with the ancient world. And, you know, we're not talking literature here. This is a book about how to cut things up. So it's sort of an interesting twist on humanism as we recognize it to be. By the last quarter of the 16th century, the market for these illustrated treatises and handbooks of many kinds, not only for carving or for cooking, but includes recipe books, so-called books of secrets, herbals, guides for farming, for metallurgy, for mining, and many others was growing. One of these books contains the first didactic images for the carver. And this is a title page from Vincenzo Cervio's Il Trinciante, which means the carver, published in Rome in 1581. Here's some of the illustrations. As you can see, these are, you know, taken in by me in a library, but they have some of the freshness of actual books. You can see a little bit of the materiality of the books, which is, like, you know, that's one of my points, and I sort of like that. But you can see there are different types of different sizes of the forks and the knives, and then specific forks and knives, and then two fowl, the turkey and the peacock. And turkeys, of course, in this period were a pretty new import into Europe. They were, it's called the gallo d'India, sort of like the Indian chicken, because it came from somewhere that wasn't Europe, so they just gave it a kind of exotic name. And then peacocks, which people did eat peacocks. I don't think they're particularly delectable, but it was something that was done. But this illustration is showing you the different parts, and it's an indication of like how you would where you might cut it. They get much more detailed later. So the key aspect of these Italian treatises, and this was really a game changer for carving, was the so-called method of carving in alto, on high, where the carver spears the meat with the fork and slices while holding it aloft, allowing the meat to fall in perfect slices to the platter. And as far as I can tell, the first image that actually depicts that is in the book that Drew mentioned in the introduction, the Bartolomeo Scapi's so-called opera, which just means works. It has nothing to do with music or opera. But I studied that book in a previous publication, and here's a carver who, as you can see, he's holding it with the fork and he's slicing with the knife. And this idea of carving on high in this performative way was a sort of big deal and it was very influential. Another really important book that was published in the early 17th century in Padua was Mattia Giger's Tre Trattati, or 3 treatises, that includes instructions on how to carve a variety of meats and also how to fold napkins. And I'm going to show you a bunch of illustrations from that. So Giger was Bavarian. He lived and worked in Padua. He served as a carver to the German community in Padua. 17th century Padua, which is northern Italy, bustling center, one of the oldest and most renowned universities in Europe. It's included specialties in botany, in medicine, and in surgery. And I think there might be some parallels to be drawn between the didactic and didactic texts about carving meat and surgical texts in terms of the detail and the idea of carving and slicing. Though I've tried to sort of look into that, and I haven't really been able to pin down exact connections, but I think it's kind of there. So examples of the images I'll display in the exhibition from this Giger book are, this is what the illustrations look like: the wild boar, the veal loin, the capon, and the fish. And the idea is to include these carving images and then to follow up on these particular types of food in the later versions or later kind of adaptations of this book, of which there are a lot. But you can see that I hope you can see that these images include not only the identification of what the cut is, and you'd never know that this was a loin of veal unless it said so. It looks like some sort of abstract image. The fish and the pig, these are more recognizable, but they also include marks of where to make the slices, the cuts, and numbers of the order in which to do the slicing. So they're incredibly precise and detailed. And that is one of the real sort of heavily influential aspects of this book. You can also see that the format, and I don't know, you can't really see it that well from these images, but I'll tell you that they are in what's called an oblong quarto. So it's like if you take a book and put it on its side. So you're not opening it in a kind of lengthwise way, but in a horizontal way. So you could actually lay the book open in a way to use it as like a workbook. And other books from the period that were read in this way or used in this way are part music, where you could have people singing different parts on the different pages. The parts were delineated in that way separately, unlike a score now, where they're often all the parts together on the same page, or instructions for tailors, or penmanship, handwriting manuals. So things that were workbooks that were meant to lay open. That's just a kind of interesting side note. This is an illustration from the Giger book showing you how the idea of the hands of the carver holding the thing, spearing it with the fork and slicing it with the knife. And there's just, it's not a very, it's not a great drawing, but it tells you the information you need to know. And that's sort of my point. And then there's a section, and this is the fruit, which is really fantastic, the fruit carving. And this is something, it's a fold out, as you can see in this image, where it all folds up into the book. So it was printed as a separate sheet. And then each individual copy of this book, this print had to be carefully folded and pasted into the book, so that when you close the book and when it's on a library shelf, for example, you have no idea that there's this incredible fold out in it. So this is one of the sort of the riches of project. It's challenging to display a fold out like this, and we're, that'll be something that we'll be working on. In the section called the piegatore, which means like folds or pleats, actually, that's the word pleat is sort of related to pieghe in Italian. There are a group of images depicting the technique of folding linens into various shapes to serve as table sculptures, which were called trionfi in Italian. And these images are incredibly evocative, just focusing on the hands of the artisan. All you see are the hands and the object, and they're just three of them. I'm showing you 1 and 2, where it's literally how you make this one pattern. In number 2, you can see it, it's called spina pesce in Italian, which means fish scales. And you can see why it's sort of called that, but it's one of the basic ways of pleating and folding that still today is it's origami and other types of folding. You would find this. So folded centerpieces, and here's another image, and these are some of the shapes that were created through these methods. And this image, I've spent a lot of time sort of looking. There's a couple of other ones like this that are numbered. It's hard to figure out exactly whether they're really sort of step by step, or as is largely the case, there's a big gap between what the craftsman or the artisan was doing and then all the stages that lead into those objects being committed to print and printed, right? Somebody has to draw them, somebody has to then engrave them, then they have to somehow be printed. And I think to a certain extent, sometimes they get confused in the process. So perhaps there is a logic here, but it has eluded me. So these techniques of folding, they're called trionfi, which it literally means triumphs in Italian. They would be maybe called Schaugerichte, show pieces in German. They were not really new in the 17th century, as a lot of earlier texts indicate. Folded centerpieces or sculpted or cast sugar or butter or even ice were employed starting in the late Middle Ages, and sometimes they're called entremets. That's a term that's often used, a French term. But what's new here is the idea that there's this sort of step-by-step instruction for the reader showing the basic shapes. The visual evidence of the trionfi is scant, but it exists in, for example, that image of the banquet in Nuremberg that I showed you at the beginning. Also in the Giger, there are these images of tables, how to set the table with some of these things indicated here, just showing you, it says, etc., right? So they're not, like, he's not going to go to the trouble of giving you every single object, but just sort of examples of like where you might place them. And I think these are clearly folded, some of the folded napkins and objects. And then, so here, here's a table, just to remind you of of what I started with. And then these table maps. So these are the earliest examples of a genre that will spread widely in Europe and in England during the 17th and 18th centuries. These indicate literally where to place certain platters on the table. And it's a style of dining where each course consisted of a variety of dishes, lots of different things that each diner could choose. And often you just end up eating what was closest to you because, it's a big table and it's hard to pass things around. But the idea of a map of displaying this organization in this sort of visual way is, I think, related to other types of visualization that are becoming very important in the 17th century. Maps in general, maps of the world, maps of sea charts, and architectural plans, and all kinds of other types of sort of visualizing order, visualizing materials. And I think it's also happening in terms of food and the table. Invention of precision tools for surveying and for navigation. And I think there are a lot of parallels in terms of zeitgeist of what's going on here. So starting around the time these images first appeared in print, in the 1620s, versions that are very, very close cropped up in books all over the German-speaking lands, and from northern Germany, Danzig, Gdansk, Königsberg, Nuremberg in the south, and eventually Amsterdam and Oslo and Copenhagen. And here are two title pages from a book published in Danzig in 1639. Only 10 years after the original Giger, and you can see the oblong format here, and you can see in this one it says Erstlich zu Padua in Italienischer Gesprach gedruckt, meaning first in Padua in Italian, in the Italian language, printed. So the idea that there's looking at Italy as the kind of trendsetter is something that is familiar in a lot of aspects of European culture in the 17th century. So I don't have time to survey all these books here tonight, obviously, but I want to show you a few more. All examples of all of these books I hope to have in my exhibition, and they'll be open to different pages. And The materiality of these objects, books as object, is also really something I hope to be able to demonstrate in the exhibition. So this is the title page to the book that I was talking about earlier, this guy Harsdorfer. And this is a fascinating image from many perspectives, but it does show a carver here seated at a table. There's an incredible, the tablecloth is very noteworthy. As you can see, it has this kind of gridded pattern. And whereas now, if any of us ever use a tablecloth, it's supposed to be ironed and sort of basically flat. But here, the tablecloth is demonstrating the fact that the labor behind creating the grid pattern is part of the display of wealth of the family. So that is why you will often see these sort of gridded patterns for linens in the period. And it's also interesting that a woman is at the head of the table. It's related to another print by somebody, Abraham Bossa, who's a French printmaker, and or Flemish printmaker, which I don't have time to get into now, but it's a very sort of typical Northern European domestic setting with the type of glass here, and there's a lot of details that are super interesting. And this is what was called a credenza, where you would store the cold dishes, the things that didn't need to come out of the kitchen hot. So things that are, perhaps salads or desserts, things that could be just ready to go, and then drinks also were on this credenza. So this guy, this is back to the Giger. I'm just showing you, just to remind you what the Italian versions look like, and then these are what in this German book published in, probably the first one was 1649, and there were several editions in the 1650s, 1660s, very similar images, and just so it's totally clear comparing the Giger on one side and on the top, and the German Harsdorfer on the bottom. So they're not using obviously the same plates, but there's an incredible borrowing and kind of reuse. There's an interesting relationship between all these texts based on the illustrations. This is the frontispiece from a related text signed by another professional carver, this guy, Andreas Klett. His name is right here. And it actually shows a carver who's in the act of instructing a pupil using what were probably wooden models of animals. And that's what was used at the time, instead of, it would be pretty messy to just have all of these, and a waste to have things. So they would learn on the models, and then they would go and practice, not have to practice with live things. That I suspect that there might be a very strong parallel to how doctors were trained in the period. So Harsdorfer was also a mathematician, and he did a lot of different stuff. And in one of the later editions of his books, there's this incredible sections about the relationship between geometry and folding. And ultimately, the idea of using folding as a way to understand geometry goes back to Dürer, it goes back to the early Renaissance, and the idea of Platonic solids. And during the 17th century, folding itself emerged as a form of mathematical education, also entertainment. But I think we all know, I'm sure, a little bit about origami, and it's both a form of leisure, but also a way to teach sort of basic geometric principles to kids. And there was a term for this, recreational mathematics, at the time, and especially the image on, the idea of taking a fruit and making it into a kind of geometric project is quite fascinating, that they would put these two things together, fruit and geometry. Okay, I'm just looking. I should rapidly move to my conclusion. Later versions of these manuals, and you can see how small this one is. also included other types of sort of entertainment elements. This is a magic lantern where you would put a candle in this and close it, and there'd be an image and it would be projected on the wall. And because the candlelight would be flickering, the image would be as if in motion. And for many people consider this the beginning of film, in fact. And the idea that there's a carving manual that has a magic lantern in it means that the same people who are supposed to be sort of entertaining the diners with their carving were also thinking of other ways to keep people entertained while they were eating, and that is projecting images of, in this case, a skeleton on the wall. And you can imagine sort of that would be kind of scary to have a moving skeleton projected on the wall. The fact that it's small also, I think, suggests something about its marketing to middle class people as opposed to maybe courtly carvers, and that's something else. This sort of one of the latest and sort of end of the exhibition is this group of it's a set of playing cards that were printed in London in the end of the 17th century that use a lot of the same carving imagery that comes directly out of the Italian treatises that I showed you a while back. And the idea was that this book contains a set of playing cards and then a short preface that has some recipes, and basically you would learn some terminology and some aspects of carving from looking at the images, but it's totally unclear to me what really the purpose of carving cards was. But there are a few sets that have survived, and it's a sort of interesting phenomenon. Exhibition will also include some actual knives. This is a presentation knife that has just sort of like a spatula that you use to serve something, not to cut it or carve it. This is a hunting knife or perhaps a carving knife, not completely clear. One of the real challenges of the actual knives is that they almost all have, these have some provenance and a coat of arms, and that's why they're in the Metropolitan Museum. But most of these objects are really difficult to date. They're difficult to really talk about in sort of in a really historical way. These have beautiful carved ivory handles, and that's why they've been collected, not because they're knives, just because of the ivory sculpture. Sometimes there are dates. This one has an actual date on it, and sometimes there are maker's marks on the blades, which is another way that you can date them. But it's very, very challenging as objects because they're not they don't have the same kind of authorial they don't express clearly their authorship in the way that a lot of other kinds of works of art do. And that's something there's a lot of work to be done in the field of art history with objects that are not signed or dated, right? They're just objects and they have a whole different type of history. And that's really, I think, very challenging. And then these fantastic buck's horn. This is a carving set. And obviously the horn of a buck was something that was linked to the culture of hunting. And so that's why these get where their identity comes from, but they're just sort of fascinating objects. And just to quickly finish off, a few textiles. And these are some knives that I will also borrow from a culinary historian who lives in the north of England and had a cutler make a set of knives based on this illustration in Bartolomeo Scapi's book. So there are a whole, and the reason he did it, and he's a good friend, is because he wanted to find out actually how they work. Do they work the way they're described here? So it's this whole aspect of material culture studies that involves what we call either recreation or there's or not reproduction. Well, we could get to that later. That's a whole other topic that it's too much. And linens, also important. The napkins, where did the linen come from? Bleaching fields in the Netherlands, Holland, and it's hard to see in this image, but you can see all these little white dots are actually like tablecloths and sheets and underwear that were all being bleached in the fields because of the sunlight and because of the milk and the water. And the Netherlands were super famous for bleaching, and then they were sold all over the place. And this is an example of a kind of napkin woven with this linen. The reason it's a photo, it's an all black and white photograph, which brings out the design. But if you actually see this in normal light, you can barely see the design. It's this very called damask weave that the Netherlands and Belgium were known for creating in the 17th century, that were shipped all over Europe at the time. So there'll be some examples of these wonderful textiles as well. So needle and thread were used to make some of the shapes. And where are my shapes? Yeah, here. So I'm just showing you, this is a reconstructed version of one of these napkin forms by a contemporary artist named Juan Salas, who's from Catalan, and he's been working in this, using these treatises to kind of recreate objects like this for many years. And this is something that was actually in an exhibition at the Met about 10 years ago, and they kept them, even though they're not, they're modern objects, but they kept them. And I'm going to be able to put some of these in the exhibition, but you can see sort of the craftsmanship, and he uses needle and thread and sometimes wooden or, some kind of mold inside them. So there's a lot of craftsmanship that's actually not even referred to in the texts, which is sort of interesting anyway. And I want to just end on with this incredible round table covered in a craggy landscape of pleats made out of linen from one of the German treatises. And thank you for your attention, and happy to answer questions about the exhibition, about these texts, about anything related to this. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Krohn. That was a really fantastic talk, and we already have a whole bunch of questions. So I'm going to dive right in, if that's okay with you. Our first one is from an anonymous attendee that says, "Thank you for your fantastic presentation, Professor Krohn. I am curious to hear more about the performativity of carving on high and its influence, which you mentioned earlier in your presentation."
Yeah, I mean, that's just, I don't know exactly where it comes from, why they started doing it. It's not part of the English tradition at all. The English don't use forks until sometime in the late 17th century. So they're still cutting, probably holding the piece of meat down with a finger or something like that while they're slicing it. It's something, I think it's related to Italian. There's a term that some of you taking Italian art history might know, sprezzatura, the idea of sort of doing something in a breezy, impressive way that seems effortless. And that's kind of what you're supposed to do with, you just hold it on the fork and you slice, and 5 slices, and there it is, it's done, like no problem. And that was sort of what the performance was about, just doing something impressive.
Wonderful. I should mention before, I know that we still have some of our speakers from earlier in the presentation, and I know the Q&A function might not be quite as easy for them. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. But we have some more questions. So let's see. How was the history of the carver's work and training responsive to dietary transformations? And were any such transformations in the carver's position a result of trade or war, or etc.?
Okay, that's a lot of questions.
Yes.
Good question. So in terms of, to rephrase the question, are people eating anything different after?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. So yes and no. If anything, that the tools change in relation to, for example, once people have forks, okay, so up to a certain point, knives, there's only knives, right? Forks don't even really come to be used commonly by most people until the 17th century. Before that, there are pointy knives that people would use to spear their food. And once people have forks, the knives are no longer pointy, they're rounded. So I don't think the food changes so much, right? People are eating the same kinds of things. There are changes in, let's say, the amount of sugar that's used in general on the in recipes, and the kinds of spices that are used and where they're coming from. And obviously there are foods that are coming from the Americas and from Asia that come into the European diet in the course of the 17th and 18th centuries based on Atlantic trade and Trans-Pacific and Asian trade and things like that. But in terms of like the raw materials, there's not that much of an evolution. It's surprisingly static in a sense.
Fascinating. Okay, let's see. Are there any precedents for this figure, a kind of prehistory of the job prior to the carver's early modern specialization and definition as a courtly role?
Yeah, in Juvenal, which is an ancient source, there's some of the Renaissance writers, I alluded to that, quote Juvenal, and they refer to this the art of courtly carving. So there were carvers, presumably in antiquity, who would be amongst the different types of servants at a kind of banquet and feast for wealthy people. So yeah, there's definitely precedent. How widespread it was, we have no idea. The only references we have are in literary sources.
Great. Okay. Apologies that all of these are anonymous, but let's see. I'm in a museum studies class where we consider how the exhibition of objects influences our reception. How will these objects be displayed? There are a lot of book materials, but towards the end, there are some usable objects. How do you see the didactics and labels around them influencing people to think about the kitchen and the kitchen objects as art?
Yeah, so I'm working with a designer on that, and I think we're gonna, obviously, when you display objects, you have to follow the rules that are established by the lenders, right? You can't just do exactly what you want. But so for example, I'm working now with textile conservators at the Met to determine whether or not I can display, there's a couple of tablecloths, for example, whether I can display them hanging on a wall or whether they have to be displayed flat. But what I hope to do is show images of knives and then some of the knives that are actual knives in pretty close proximity so that people can understand that the texts are actually not, they're not fantasy land. They're referring to actual objects that existed at the time. And even though we have a pretty unrepresentative survival of objects because they're things that were in good condition and were collected and placed in museums, and that's the bias. And it's the same with the books also, right? We have really nice, clean copies of books that were preserved and collected and have been in libraries normally for at least a couple hundred years. So they're not going to show signs of use or wear the way actual books might have. So you're dealing with a combination of, the rules and regulations of that, how you can display each book has their different rules. Each book can only be opened to a certain degree. And some books have to have a kind of cradle that comes from the lending institution, and other books you can make your own. You're not, as a curator, you're kind of somewhat at the mercy of, exhibitions are collaborative. Let's just put it that way. That's a nicer way of saying, like, you might have your vision, but you work within a lot of complicated rules and regulations. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think so.
I think so. We have another question that I think is really interesting. This person asked, what is the relationship between carving, cutting, and engraving? Do we see some connection between bookmaking and preparing dinner? So I guess sort of elaborating on the cutting and the carving of the cutting and the engraving and representing those sort of actions with an action that is somewhat similar. And then also between bookmaking and preparing food, the way you prepare a book is many parts to creating a book, but there's also many parts to creating a dinner. So those.
So there should be, right? I mean, there certainly is, in conceptually, and that's a really nice way of thinking about it as a parallel. In practice, whether or not it was the same people who were actually carving things, making engravings, and being carvers for food, I don't think so. I think that they were pretty siloed off in terms of skill sets and training, and even things like, just there were, and there are different kinds of tools, but certainly the people who are engraving plates for the print may have been interested in the knives and the shapes of the knives, but I don't think there's a formal relationship that you could really trace between those two. I think the thing with the surgeons, that's more likely, just because there are more parallels there. But I think just engravers, I mean, one of the big questions is, how did any of these images get created? Like how, and I think a lot of, well, we know there are some manuscript carving books that were actually teaching tools that have survived, that have sort of, some parts of them are printed images and then there's student notes on them. So they were using them. And then at a certain point, they, somebody had probably a publisher had the idea to come out with an actual printed book that included the instructions from the carver so that they could market that as a form of knowledge that you didn't have to take the class to get the information, right? Essentially.
Right. Great. We have another anonymous question that says, can you elaborate further on how this food presentation added to excuse me, I'm not very good at German, Gematzkunstwerk type of, thank you, type of experience? Have you been able to draw connections between these items and the art displayed on the walls of dining halls?
Good question. To a certain extent, when we know about the kinds of art that was on the walls, which we often don't. One place that we do know what was on the wall was monastic refectories, right? There are a lot of really famous pictures from refectories, including Leonardo's Last Supper and a whole host of other sort of images of the Last Supper that are often put in, that are often used in refectories in monastic settings. But I mean, we do know there's a set of paintings by an Italian painter from the 1580s named Vincenzo Campi, and he has these wonderful kind of large scale pictures that have like fruit and vegetable markets and markets with, fowl and things like that. I mean, there's all kinds of food related imagery, but we don't have a lot of examples to draw from because we have, obviously frescoes are still going to be in situ, but paintings get moved around, right? I mean, that's the problem in the early modern period.
Yeah, exactly. Another question we have says, you mentioned that meat carving was associated with religious practice. Were European carving or banquet practices influenced by the Islamic customs of medieval Spain? Interesting.
That is a really interesting question. Potentially, yes, but the one source that we have for late medieval Spain, which is the Vienna, that treatise that I was talking about, is from a Christian court context. So there's not a lot of evidence for, the Islamic traditions were incredibly important in terms of dietetics. In other words, the sorts of foods how food affected the body, and the relationship between food and health and wellness. And a lot of the information about that was passed down through Islamic sources to not only to medieval Spain, but also in general to medieval Europe, to Sicily and southern Italy especially, but ultimately, really, generally speaking, the Islamic sources preserve knowledge from the ancient world as it did in other forms of scientific knowledge like astronomy and geometry and other types of mathematics. So yes, there's definitely a relationship, but specifically in terms of carving, I don't know of any sources that deal specifically with carving from Islamic Spain. So do some research, look into it.
Of course. We pass that on to whoever asked that question.
Yes, I mean, there's a huge more research to be done in this area. It's very open. So if anybody is looking around for topics that are less traveled,
Definitely. And forgive me, did you mention where the exhibition will be held?
It's going to be at the Bard Graduate Center, which
wonderful.
is where I teach on 86th Street in Manhattan.
And when will it be open to the public? Is it still very much in the early phases, or?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it was supposed to open. It was supposed to already be, happening now, but it was postponed because
of course,
pandemic, and now it's supposed to open in February of 2023. So we'll see. Hopefully that will stick. Hopefully we won't have another. There won't be a lot more changes, but that is the plan right now.
Great. And in your teaching, are you going to incorporate some sort of like project with the exhibition? And if so, like, do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, so I'm teaching a seminar now where our students are doing research projects that are about different aspects of food in early modern Europe. They're not specifically about the exhibition, but they could be. And in the past, I have had seminars where students have done projects about the carving cards and about some of the cutlery, doing basic research on the cutlery that's at the Met that's completely uncatalogued and nobody's ever really worked on it. It's just like in these drawers. And because it's so problematic, it's not the kind of thing that gets any airtime at a museum like the Met, right? Because it's just like it's too anonymous.
Right.
So yes, absolutely. I do try to involve. It's been a little frustrating because during the pandemic we couldn't actually go back to the museum. But in this fall, I've had two incredible visits to different departments at the Met where we have been able to look at objects behind the scenes, and students have been able to see them and not, so that's really incredibly fun. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really through teaching that this whole project has sort of come into focus for me. And it's great to be able to kind of do research through teaching, which is, I think very, very good for students too, because it's fresh, you're not just teaching the same class over and over again.
Yes, of course. As a student, we appreciate things like that.
Yeah. Sometimes you you assign an article and it's terrible because you didn't have time to finish reading it before you sign into the class. And then you realize like, okay, sorry about that. That was bad. So, there's sometimes it's not always like 100% perfect, but that's just the way it is.
But it's fresh and interesting, and it's sort of exciting as students for us to work through those things with the professor and sort of see their thought processes on how they develop their projects.
Yes, well, that is what we hope.
Yes. Well, we enjoy that. I believe that's all the questions that we have. If there are any more questions, I encourage people to ask them. But we have one that says, just a quick refresher, can you repeat the contemporary artist and their models? I think that refers to the pad thai thing you were discussing at the very beginning.
Yeah, Rick Ritt Tiravanit, and it's spelled Tira Vanjaya. It's a Thai word that looks pronounced differently than it looks. But if you just Google Rikrut, RIKR, I don't know, go back to my image. You'll find it. He's incredibly famous, at least in the late 20th century, and apparently there's a revival now. So yeah, thank you very much. Paul thank you very much.
Well, I think if that is all the questions, is there anything else you'd like to touch on before we close up? But if not, that's okay.
Thank you all. Thank you for your attention. It's 10 o'clock in New York. I know it's only 7 o'clock in LA, but I think you've had probably enough lectures for one evening. So I think
we're very grateful to you for your great talk and for joining us. And we're very, like I just said, very grateful. And I will pass it back off to Sosa to close us out for the evening.
I'm back. Okay.